Okay, so I hope everyone can hear me clearly.
Excellent.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present on an aspect of cities which we generally ignore, and that is cultural heritage. So the title I have given to my presentation is Reducing Risks to Urban Cultural Heritage Through Engagement of Multiple Stakeholders. Now, first of all, let's look at what do we mean by cultural heritage in urban context. Are we only talking about just monuments which are protected by fences or with gates, or are we talking about traditional neighborhoods which are dynamic, where residents are living and for generations, and which is part of their day-to-day living? It is actually a living and dynamic urban context that we are talking about, both with its tangible as well as intangible manifestations, which really contribute towards identity and resilience. And that is something that needs to be protected against natural disasters or even those which are caused by humans. Now, if we look at the reality of heritage, if we see only the monuments and we forget about the context within which these monuments are located, we actually don't understand their reality. The reality of this monument is not just this photograph, but it is this reality which is around this monument. So what does that mean? It means that these heritage structures have got a contemporary relationship to the inhabitants in their urban surroundings. So we cannot just deal with these monuments without really without really taking into consideration the context which is determined by people who are living around these. So what are we talking about when we really talk of heritage in an urban context? We are talking about historic urban landscapes where we cannot isolate monuments, we cannot isolate traditional housing from other components. We are actually looking at cities in relationship to their ecological and environmental relationship to the surroundings, the peri-urban areas, the rural areas, this dynamic interrelationship that has actually contributed to survival and growth and evolution of these cities. This is what we need to protect, and ironically, because of this getting lost, this interrelationship being affected by many factors, are we actually becoming more vulnerable to disasters? So from this point of view, I'm addressing this whole issue of protecting urban heritage and engaging multiple stakeholders. Now let's look at what happens to heritage as a result of disasters. We have plenty of examples where heritage has really been impacted very adversely because of many natural as well as human-induced factors. Now, we have a recent example of floods in Bangkok, which were really devastating, and not only they caused a lot of damage to human lives and the properties, but they also affected very important heritage sites which were located right in the middle of urban environment. Take example of Bangkok or even Ayutthaya, which is a World Heritage Site. It's a town which has this archaeological site in the midst of its new development, and it was very adversely affected because of these floods. Now, we also have other examples. For example, look at Rome, which had experienced floods in 2008, and St. Peter's Cathedral and all the surroundings were also very, very badly affected. We also have example of floods in Hanoi, Vietnam. Now, of course, the entire urban area was flooded, but what happened as a result of that was that archaeological sites, which were located right in the middle of the city, were really adversely affected because of the change in the topography. Of course, archaeological sites are very much below ground, and because of the improper drainage, a lot of waterlogging happened, which caused immense damage to this heritage. There is also example of other kinds of disasters, and we have a very classic case of fire in the historic district of Edinburgh in 2002, and this is in fact a World Heritage city and the impact of fire has been is irreplaceable, because what has been lost is very difficult to get back. So we are facing these immense issues of our vulnerable urban heritage, and which is in fact becoming increasingly vulnerable now with climate change and issues like global terrorism, which is making it even more vulnerable. We have also example from India, where historic town of Bhuj was very badly damaged after 2001 earthquake. Now, what does the question that I want to pose here is whether we are only concerned about the physical parts of heritage, or is it something more than that? And I would like to mention here that we are in fact not just talking about built heritage. What we are really concerned about are people's safety, because of course this is a living heritage. People are living there. We are talking about social change. In many cases, the community profile has changed because of immigration, because of changing population densities. The communities which have been living for generations have now moved out, or new people have come in, and of course they have very different relationship to the physical heritage. So that is another kind of impact that one sees. And of course, loss of economy and livelihoods. So one sees, when one in fact understands the impact on urban heritage, it is very difficult to isolate just monuments on just physical form, fabric, from all these different factors that have to be accounted for if we have to make our heritage protected from disasters. So urban cultural heritage, especially the ones which are unprotected and unrecognized, like housing or those humble parts of heritage, are much more vulnerable to disasters. Now, I'll go into some issues regarding vulnerability of these urban cultural heritage. First issue that I want to focus here is that we tend to always look upon either earthquake or flooding or fire, but when we look at historic urban areas, especially when they are part of a larger urban environment, we are in fact talking about multiple hazards. Take, for example, the case of Kobe, where there was not just earthquake, but the entire historic urban neighborhood was damaged because of fire. Of course, because they were wooden houses, and when earthquake shook these buildings, there were electric short circuits, and which caused really damage to a large part of the very historic neighborhood of this city. We are also not just talking about fire or issues related to the sites themselves. Sometimes the risks are coming from the surroundings. Take example of Kathmandu Valley, where the World Heritage Site is in fact not just this ensemble, but it's surrounded by a very dense urban fabric. And what is happening is, of course, the heritage site, which is designated as World Heritage, is protected, but there are hardly any controls or regulations in the surroundings of this World Heritage Site. So what's happening? These kinds of transformations are taking place in urban surroundings, which are in fact highly vulnerable to earthquakes. This is in fact one of the most vulnerable area to earthquakes, and we are expecting a big earthquake in very near future. So you can understand what will happen in case an earthquake was to strike this area. All the access routes to this important site would be blocked, and people who would be, lots of visitors are there in these heritage sites, and they will be just blocked there, and they would not be able to move out while the emergency services cannot come in. So we are facing this huge issue, which we just cannot resolve by having only heritage managers talk about risk reduction. We have to engage the context of these heritage sites, which means many other stakeholders. I'll come to this issue later. We are also, this I think has been talked about yesterday, but I want to highlight that a related issue of increasing disaster vulnerability is also loss of traditional urban boundaries. And that is in fact creating much more vulnerability, because delicate ecological relationships have been destroyed, sometimes beyond repair, and these are making them much more vulnerable to, for example, flooding. Now, urban heritage, as I mentioned before, has a contemporary relationship to people's lives and livelihoods, and we have to really take this into account. especially in developing countries, especially in those contexts where cities are dynamically evolving. On one hand, we have cities under tremendous pressure, but on another hand, we also have many historic towns and historic urban areas which have been, in fact, have been abandoned. So you see, these are important buildings which are part of a very historic cities, but there is nobody to live there because there are no livelihood opportunities available. So people have moved out, and this heritage is getting dilapidated because there is nobody to take care of them. So if I have to summarize these vulnerability issues, in fact, it is not just an issue of looking at heritage in isolation. It is about connecting heritage to issues that really affect urban areas today, especially in developing countries, which are, of course, poverty, lack of livelihood opportunities, weak governance, social inequity, loss of traditional skills and capacities. And I would like to mention here that, in fact, a lot of heritage buildings, heritage planning, the way historically cities have been planned, have a lot of lessons for us to kind of capture in terms of disaster mitigation, because people have really evolved these through their experience over time. And I have already mentioned that there is a loss of traditional ecological relationships. So, in fact, if we have to reduce vulnerabilities of cities, there are a lot of connections with heritage in terms of what we can learn in the traditional resilience mechanisms that have been evolved by the communities. And, of course, it is also important to understand that a lot of our heritage is, in fact, surviving because of people who are poor. So on one hand, they are vulnerable, but on the other hand, they are the ones who are keeping this heritage. So the other issue that we face in case of urban heritage after disasters is insensitive demolition. And again, here there is the issue of lack of coordination between stakeholders, because a lot of heritage buildings which are of very high significance are just pulled down because the rescue agencies who come in are not sensitive, or they are not even aware of the values of these heritage structures in urban areas. And so we find that a lot of historic cities are just cleared out, or they are just made, the entire spaces are cleaned up just in the name of safety. So this is another issue that is very much there. Now,
may I ask you, Rohit?
Yes. So what we are going to look at are different stakeholders. On one hand, we have heritage sector, which has different stakeholders like communities, trusts, private owners, or agencies of culture. On the other hand, we have urban development sector, which has stakeholders or departments which are from environment, services, land use planning, housing, public transport. And of course, we have disaster management sector that has civic defense, NGOs, communities, municipalities. Now, the challenge is lack of coordination between these three main sectors and different stakeholders that are there. So I'm just going to conclude here by really saying that what we are trying to do as part of our university in our training course, and also as our pilot projects, is to work towards developing integrated urban disaster risk reduction, which is taking into account multiple hazards and vulnerabilities, and which actually tries to mainstream heritage into risk reduction for cities. And we are trying to really pull together four of these important sectors that are separated, but we need to pull them together, namely urban development, emergency management, disaster risk reduction, and heritage conservation and management. So on one hand, we are talking about including cultural heritage needs into urban development policies, and on the other hand, we are talking about how do we have cultural heritage managers coordinate with urban development agencies. When we do our training, our exercises, we find that there is complete lack of even the basic coordination or basic knowledge about the institutions that are there, which have to be really working together in order to reduce risks. So I will conclude with this last slide by emphasizing this, which we really do in our courses, in our pilot activities, that if we have to do disaster risk management for cultural heritage properties, we have to connect them on one hand with the management systems for heritage properties that are already existing, which means thinking about maintenance and monitoring, and on the other hand, to link them with disaster or crisis management systems for the urban or regional regions within which these sites are located. It needs a multidisciplinary approach, and we need to understand the vocabulary that is used by cultural heritage development and disaster risk reduction sectors. So this from there I'd like to end here. Thank you very much.